We have been looking at the person of Jesus through the gospel lenses of Mark. And we come now to the 10th chapter, and we're going to be looking at first 16 verses. And as such, I entitled this, Jesus and the Family, what Jesus has to say about the family. And that really is the emphasis that I would like tonight's study to try to go to. When we talk about this as a subject and as a topic, I think it's best for us to look at what God said about the family and then take what we go through from there and match it up against God's Word. So, you have your Bibles, open them up to Mark chapter 10, and we're just going to look at the first 16 verses. I'm going to take you through some of them. We're going to do a little bit of paralleling with Matthew 19. That's going to be the parallel that carries with us from Mark 10. And we're going to look at a couple other passages as well. But beginning at Mark chapter 10, beginning of verse 1, it says, "Then he arose from there and came to the region of Judea by the other side of the Jordan. And the multitude gathered to him again, and as he was accustomed, he taught them again." Verse 2 introduces us to a question where the Pharisees, and this was just one of many questions that the Pharisees presented to him as to try to entrap him by his own words. Knowing where there was discussion and difference of thought, they wanted to ask him questions like, do we pay taxes? In this particular question, it says in verse 2, "And the Pharisees came and asked him, 'Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?' Testing him." And that's the motivation. That's the whole purpose behind this question. It wasn't something that Mark was trying to deal with. It wasn't something that Jesus came to teach about. It was something that the Pharisees wanted to test him and to get his thoughts on. And so, and by the way, let me just go ahead and inject here that the question in Matthew 19:3 is essentially the same question, but they add but they add an extra phrase in there, which gives us a little insight as to why the Pharisees asked this question. In Matthew 19:3, it says, "The Pharisees also came to him, testing him and saying to him, 'Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for just any reason?'" And that's what is recorded in Matthew's account. And the reason for that is because there was a difference of opinion between the Pharisees and the Sadducees over this particular question. And so they're on one hand, they're asking him about a topic. On the other hand, they're trying to say, well, whose side of the fence are you on this? So they asked him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his, and they were testing him. His response, verse 3, was to say, what did Moses command you? What's the Old Testament say? What did Moses command you? And verse 4, they responded. They said, well, Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and to dismiss her. That's what the law says. So I went ahead and did a little research to find out, well, what is he referring to? And this expression, the certificate of divorce, is not, there's not a lot about it, but it's mostly found in just one part of the law, Deuteronomy chapter 24. When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some uncleanliness in her. That sounds a little ambiguous, but that I think is what the Pharisees were trying to determine when he says, is it for any reason? He says, no, when he has found some uncleanliness in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, sends her out of his house, and when she has departed from his house, goes and becomes another man's wife. If the latter husband detests her and writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies, who took her as his wife, well, the law says then her former husband who divorced her must not take her back to be his wife after she has been defiled. Now, that's part of the law, but what the law is saying here is actually kind of a reference to the oneness that comes out of a marriage relationship. That she's not just to be passed from family to family, from husband to husband, and then back to another husband. there is something involved in the marriage relationship, and this is what Jesus is about to get to, that is really, I think, the heart of the teaching, is not so much what divorce is, but what God's design is. You want to know, what did God have in mind when He made male and female? And so this is what it says, that he's not to take her out after she's been defiled, for that is an abomination before the Lord. And you should not bring sin on the land which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. That's Deuteronomy 24, 1 through 4. That's the Old Testament passage that the Pharisees are referring to when they reference, but Moses said we could give her a certificate of divorce. And that's what that is. But even in that Old Testament passage and that law, you have that element of oneness in a marriage. And it's carried even in the law. Well, what did Jesus say to them then? Well, go back to Mark 10. We pick up where we left off, verse 5. Mark says, because of the hardness of your heart, He wrote you the precept. But from the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. And then He adds, and this is from the book of Genesis, and by the way, this is all before the fall. This is all before sin. The design of God was, for this reason a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, in a sense, this is how He's answering them. What God has joined together out of His design, you don't let man separate. You don't let man take it apart or tear it apart. So therefore, what God has joined together, let not man say. And there's also this distinction. God designed this, but man purposed that something else had to be done. And so this is, and we're going to see that it was because of the result of sin that divorce even exists. That from the beginning it was not so. It was not to be part of God's design. God's design was one man, one woman, one life. And then He makes this statement. What He had said earlier at the beginning, but because of the hardness of your heart, He wrote you this precept. Matthew says basically the same thing. Look at it again. I have this down at Matthew 19. You're not there, so don't worry about looking at it. But here's what Matthew 19, 4 through 6 says. He answered and said to them, have you not read that He who made them at the beginning made them male and female? He's saying basically what we just read in Mark. And for this reason a man shall leave his father and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So then they are no longer two but one. Therefore what God has joined together, let no man separate. And he says essentially the same thing in Matthew 19. He answers the question by presenting the design of God. The design of God, one man, one woman for life. And as I indicated in your notes, divorce then, though, was one of the results of sin, because in Matthew 19, they press Him a little farther. They said, why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and put her away? In Mark, it was like, He gave us permission, but now they're saying, from Matthew, they're saying, so why then did He make this provision? And the response is what we read in Mark 10. Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning, it was not so. So when you look at God's design, when you look at God's ideal, and I realize that most everybody's going to look at me and say, but we're not living under God's ideal. We're not living in a perfect world. And that's the point. The point is that divorce grew out of sin. And the thought that a husband would put away his wife came out of the fact that there is sin now in the world. I don't think it was ever in the heart of God or the thought of God or the mind of God that Adam and Eve would ever have a divorce. Now that may sound a little simple, but I think when He set it up, just as He did not anticipate there to be death, He did not anticipate there to be divorce. But these are some of the things that sin has created and brought into our world. And so it is here. Now, I even wrote this in my notes. I would love nothing more than the end of the study with Jesus' response to the question. I would love nothing more than to say, and thus saith the Lord, and let's go home. But then in Mark 10, verses 10 through 12, the disciples push the issue. And they follow up with their own question. Look what your Bible says, Mark chapter 10, verses 10 through 12. In the house, after he had gotten away from the Pharisees, this is not a debate with them. This is now a question on the part of his disciples who want to find themselves pleasing to God. On the part of the disciples in the house, his disciples also asked him again about the same matter. So what does he say to them? Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if a woman divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. Now, I cannot take away or add to anything that Jesus just said. Can I explain it fully? Not really. A lot of questions have come up over the years. Does this mean adultery in perpetuity? Does it go on being being adultery all through the relationship? Does it mean that divorce is not a sin, but remarriage is? There's a lot of questions that I really don't feel like I can attack or answer for you. And I may have just opened a can of worms that I can't close. But the disciples asked him this, and this was the response he gave them. And this is not the first time he said this. This is very similar to what Jesus said in both the Sermon on the Mount and then what we've already been looking at in Matthew 19. In the Sermon on the Mount, in Matthew 5, you remember that Jesus takes the letter of the law and then contrasts it with the spirit of the law? He says, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, or, I say, turn the other cheek. You said, thou shalt not thou shalt not murder. I say, don't even hate. Don't even say fool to somebody. And he took the letter of the law and he moved it to the spirit of the law. Well, here's what he said about divorce in the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew 5:31, he says, furthermore, it has been said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that whoever divorces his wife for any reason except sexual immorality causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a woman who is divorced commits adultery. Now, he did this in the Sermon on the Mount when he went from the letter of the law to the spirit of the law. And I think the spirit of the law is basically saying what God's design was, and that God's design was that God wanted one man, one woman for life. And when you start passing women around, that's the same as adultery. Now, by the way, let me just throw in for what it's worth. He also said, if you lust after a woman in your heart, you've committed adultery. So don't feel like divorce is the only issue where adultery comes into play as the result of the spirit of the law. So, having been found in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 19:9 says essentially the same thing. I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality, marries another, commits adultery, and whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. It makes, and I've heard this referred to as the exception clause of sexual immorality. In a sinful world, I know that we look at relationships different than God does. And we're about to see why in just a moment. We're about to see why God exalts marriage as high as he does. I think the problem with us today in our culture and our society is that we have so diminished the high view of marriage that God established when he first gave Eve to Adam and when the first marriage was instituted, that we've made it something that is of very little significance. But to be honest, and I have this on your notes, the Bible is full of stories of God's people who did not live up to God's design. It's full of stories of God's people who did not live up to God's design or God's ideal. And if we look at marriage, one man, one woman, one life, we're looking at an ideal, we're looking at a design. Now, please don't take what I'm about to say as an excuse or a justification for us to do whatever we feel is best for us. But I hope you realize that most of the patriarchs had more than one living wife. Abraham did. Isaac did. Jacob had 4. The 12 tribes of Israel came from 4 women. But most all of the patriarchs had more than one living wife, including Judah, the tribe through whom Jesus would come, including Moses, the lawgiver, including David, and goodness, Solomon. I don't even want to go there. I don't think we can go as far as to say that this was God's ideal, even though these were men of God that God used. You follow what I'm saying? The Bible is full of stories of God's people who did not live up to God's design and God's ideal. You ever had problems with the book of Hosea where God commands Hosea to marry a harlot? Hosea 1:2 says, when the Lord began to speak to Hosea, the Lord said to Hosea, go, take yourself a wife of harlotry and children of harlotry. For the land has committed great harlotry by departing from the Lord. He used Hosea's family life to illustrate what Israel had done to God. Which brings us back again to what we're going to see in just a moment. Why this ideal is in place to begin with. I think the ideal and the design of marriage was to be the greatest illustration of God's desire of the relationship He wants to have with man. That's the bottom line. I think when we look at marriage, we're looking at what God had in mind for our relationship with Him. Ezra, you ever read the book of Ezra? After rebuilding the temple, he directed Israel to send away or divorce all their pagan wives. Jeremiah wrote that God had given Israel a certificate of divorce for her harlotries. Jeremiah 3:8. Then I saw that all the causes for which backsliding Israel had committed adultery, and I had put her away and given her a certificate of divorce. Yet her treacherous sister Judah did not fear, but went and played the harlot also. And yet, having said all of this, we come to Malachi, the last of the Old Testament writers, and we find this statement. The Lord God of Israel says that He hates divorce. He hates divorce. It covers one's garments with violence, says the Lord. Therefore, take heed to your spirit that you do not deal treacherously. So you have this ideal, you have this design, you have these examples where even godly people weren't following it. But I'm afraid that by focusing on divorce, we lose sight of what Jesus is really teaching. You see, when you make the topic of this discussion divorce and not God's design, you lose what Jesus was trying to say that day. So let me go back now and tell you what I think He was trying to say to those Pharisees and to us today. And that is commitment and faithfulness. Go back and looking at Mark 10:6-8. But from the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife. The two shall become one flesh. They will no longer be one flesh. From the beginning of creation, God desired man to be able to reflect His glory. We know that. From the beginning of creation, He created man with the capacity, by having placed His Spirit in man, to teach his mind, control his emotions, direct his behavior, to reflect His image. And then the fall came. But before the fall came, He gave them marriage. Marriage was before the fall. It was part of His design. It was to be the relationship of oneness that Jesus has just now spoken about. And the two shall become one. It's that relationship of oneness, of commitment. The marriage relationship was God's greatest illustration on earth of what His eternal relationship with us would be like in heaven. We find this throughout the Old Testament. I've shared this verse not too long ago. In fact, I shared it when we talked about the new heaven, the new earth, and that we will be given the happy new you. You remember that message? That one of the parts of that was that we would be given a new name. Here's what Isaiah 62, 2-5 says. The Gentiles shall see your righteousness, all the kings your glory. You shall be called by a new name, which the mouth of the Lord will name. You shall be called Hephzibah. This is Isaiah 62, verse 5. You shall be called Hephzibah, which means the Lord's delight. And your land will be called Beulah. You know that song, don't you? Do you know what Beulah means? It means married. God is saying to Israel, we are married, and He delights in you, and your land shall be married. Jeremiah, the prophet, said in Jeremiah 3:14, return, O backsliding children, says the Lord, for I am married to you. This is how he describes his relationship with Israel, by using this picture of the oneness that comes with marriage. When you come to the New Testament, of all the terms, and we've looked at this before, and I even had this before I put it in your notes, you probably have seen it in other notes as well. One of the names of the church is the bride of Christ. We are called the bride of Christ. Why? Because we are the object of God's love. In John 3:29, again, I have just the scriptures in your notes, but let me just share with you what they say. In John 3:29, John the Baptist is speaking, and here's how he refers to Jesus. He says, he who has the bride is the bridegroom. Talking about they were wanting to make something out of John. John says, no, I must decrease, because he who has the bride is the bridegroom. I'm the friend of the bridegroom, who stands and hears and rejoices greatly because of the bridegroom's voice. Therefore, this joy of mine is fulfilled. I'm the friend of the bridegroom. Jesus is the bridegroom, and His church is the bride. In Ephesians 5:30-32, you will see a lot that's being said by Paul to the family. And again, I don't want to make this a whole lot about Paul's instruction to the family, but Paul makes a statement that illustrates what I'm saying about how the New Testament calls us the bride of Christ. He says in Ephesians 5:30-32, for we are members of His body, of His flesh and His bones. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to the wife, and two shall become one flesh. He's quoting the same passage we've been looking at that Jesus has been quoting. The oneness passage that comes out of a husband-wife relationship. And then he says in verse 32, this is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church. This whole idea of the two shall become one, he says that's not just about a husband and wife. That's about Christ and His church. Because the greatest illustration of God and His people is the marriage relationship. Jesus is trying to exalt it. Man is trying to find a way out of it. We've looked most recently also in our Sunday morning services about the book of Revelation and Jesus coming back. Revelation 19:7-9. Let us be glad and rejoice and give him glory, for the marriage of the Lamb has come. That's what you and I are looking forward to. You know, once we are raptured and taken out of this world, we'll be taken to heaven. We'll be in preparation for the marriage supper of the Lamb. And guess who is getting married? The Lamb and the bride. The marriage supper of the Lamb has come. His wife has made herself ready, and to her it was granted to be arrayed in fine linen, clean and bright, for the fine linen is the righteous acts of the saints. That's our gown. The righteous acts of the saints. Verse 9, then he said to me, write, blessed are those who are called to the marriage supper of the Lamb. And then in chapter 21, John describes the vision of seeing the New Jerusalem coming down out of heaven from God. And how does he describe it? As a bride adorned for her husband. And one of the angels came to me and talked with me, saying, come, I will show you the bride. It's the Lamb's wife. So, the final part, and I think this is what I have on the back side of your notes, how then should we view divorce? In light of how Jesus exalts marriage, how should we, as God's people, view divorce? Well, first thing is what every pastor tells every couple when they come into counseling. You don't take this thing lightly. You don't just decide it is a contractual agreement between two consenting adults based on how you feel about one another right now. Richard and I was talking about this. There's a difference between a contractual arrangement and a covenant relationship. And this is a covenant relationship that we have, a husband with a wife. I don't know if you thought about this when you stood before the church, when you stood before the pastor, when you stood before your friends and family, but wedding vows, marriage vows, are not just made to each other. They are made to God. You are making vows not only to the husband or to the wife. You're making them before God, you're making them to God. And that's why sometimes in the vows you'll even hear the words, "So help me God." Now, this again elevates the marriage ceremony beyond what our culture and our society wants to make it. A lot of times we see marriages of convenience, or marriages just of how people feel at the moment. But a marriage is a vow. And Ecclesiastes 4 and 5 says, when you make a vow to God, do not delay to pay it. He has no pleasure in fools. You pay what you've vowed. And then he makes the statement in Ecclesiastes 5:5, better not to vow than to vow and not pay. Take it seriously. Take marriage seriously. Take the decision to marry seriously. And those of you who have children who are going to be taking this up with you, teach them that it is not to be entered into lightly. Those are not just words of a preacher at the beginning of a wedding ceremony. It is a powerful, powerful truth that needs to be understood. Secondly, we should avoid divorce at all cost. I remember Cindy and I had this conversation that before we got married, we said to each other, whatever happens, divorce is not an option. 1 Corinthians tells us about love. And when it tells us about love, it makes this statement. Verses 4 through 8 is the description. Love. And when you think about, there's no greater love than the love between a husband and a wife. Love suffers long and is kind. Love does not envy, does not parade itself, is not puffed up, does not behave rudely, does not seek its own, is not provoked, doesn't keep track of offenses. That's what thinks no evil means. It doesn't keep a record of all the wrongs. Does not rejoice in iniquity, rejoices in the truth. But more importantly, it bears all things, it believes all things, it hopes all things, it endures all things, and love never fails. And that's the Word of God. And that's what the love that we say we have for one another is supposed to be like. So we should avoid divorce at all costs. But it happens, doesn't it? It does. It happens. And when it does happen, the first thing the Bible wants us to try to do is to seek reconciliation. There's a lot of reasons that people seek a divorce, and I understand the thinking here. You don't want to be kept in an abusive relationship. Jesus himself talked about, except for sexual immorality, there's adultery, that's sexual unfaithfulness. There's abuse, that's physical and emotional abuse. There's abandonment. Sometimes they just leave, get up and leave. Or they're just not meeting the necessary needs. And then there's that apathy that I just don't feel anything for them. I have no feeling whatsoever. I have fallen out of love. Well, if we've already talked about this before, if you can fall out of it, it wasn't love. It wasn't love. Because we've already seen that love never fails. It endures all things. So whatever it wasn't love. Call it something else. But here's the note, and I hope I put this in your notes. Those things, unfaithfulness, abuse, not meeting necessary needs, no feelings. Do you realize that Christ experienced all these things from us? He experienced all those things from man. And then turned around and offered forgiveness and reconciliation. So he becomes our example. He's able to extend the grace for us to do the same. That's why the Gospel of Luke says, take heed to yourselves. If your brother sins against you, you can even put if your husband or wife sins against you, rebuke him. If he repents, forgive him. If he sins against you 7 times a day, 7 times in a day returns to you saying, I repent. Forgive him. When divorce does happen, we should at least seek reconciliation. But when that reconciliation is unrestorable, when divorce is unavoidable and unrestorable, then the Scripture tells you this: avoid bitterness at all cost. Don't make that toxic relationship something that you rehearse to others over and over and over so that their lives are destroyed in the eyes of others. Bitterness will cause you to look at past situations, even if the other party will not reconcile. Learn what it means to forgive them to avoid your own personal bitterness. I've said this before. I've got this, I think, in your notes. Bitterness is a poison that destroys the vessel in which it is stored more than the object upon which it is poured. Bitterness will destroy you, not the person you're bitter against. So by all means, when it is unavoidable and unrestorable, at least avoid the bitterness that may come out of that situation. Hebrews 12:15 says, looking carefully lest anyone fall short of the grace of God. Why does it say that? Because God gives the grace to forgive. When God gives the grace to forgive, you embrace His grace with faith and you forgive. You emotionally release the individual of the offense. That's what forgiveness is. And He gives us, if anyone should fall short of the grace of, or beware, or looking carefully lest anyone fall short of the grace of God, lest any root of bitterness springing up will cause trouble, and by this many will become defiled. So if it's unavoidable and unrestorable, at least avoid bitterness. And if it's taken place, you see where I've come to now? See, I'm trying to say, I know what the ideal is, and I know where we are. But if it has come into the situation, the Bible still speaks to us about it. Seek reconciliation. If that doesn't happen, avoid bitterness. But also, allow God to rebuild your life. One of the things that I think happens when sin comes in is that it has a tendency to break us in different ways. Bill Gothard used to give this illustration that sometimes people get broken by their sin in ways that are not just unavoidable, that are, what's the word that I'm looking for? Irreparable. Thank you. That are irreparable. He says it's kind of like somebody, that God is like using different things, like a hammer and a chisel, to make a beautiful diamond out of our lives. But when we allow sin to come in, there is damage that's done. And it's almost as though the chisel breaks off a part of the diamond, and you say, well, it can never be a diamond anymore. No, it can. It can. Just a smaller diamond. Even a broken diamond can be recut to shine. Just not as big or as bright as the original. God can redeem any life from where it finds Him. We just need to seek His will. We need to seek His way. This goes a little further than I think what Jesus was saying in terms of how we should handle divorce, but I hope you heard Jesus. That Jesus said from the beginning it wasn't supposed to be this way. This is the way it was supposed to be. But because of the hardness of our hearts, divorce is a part of who we are and where we are now. So the rest of what I have there on that back page is just hopefully some godly suggestions from the Word of God, how to pick up the pieces. I didn't put this in your notes, but let me just go ahead and close with this. I'm going to go back down. Verse 13 talks about the only part about the family we haven't talked about tonight, and why divorce needs to be avoided at all costs. They brought little children to him. You see, every time this subject is talked about here, it's followed up by children. And that becomes part of the equation that we cannot ignore. Especially when children today tend to end up going into counseling and thinking that they're the ones that was responsible for it. They hurt. See, we're doing more than just tearing two that was one flesh apart, and you can't do that without something hurting. You're also tearing children from a family and parents. Can you see why I would say to avoid it at all costs? Whatever you can do to avoid it, avoid it. Let's close there. This is what Jesus had to say about it in Mark 10. There's other things that Paul will say about it later in his letter to the Corinthians, and then when he addresses the subject as it affects overseers and deacons. We're not going to go down that road tonight. But as far as what this study is about how Jesus sees the family, I hope that by tonight you've seen some things that need to be reminded of, at least. God has a design, and we are a part of it. And we need to help others to see it as well. Amen? Let's pray.